All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. We don't yet have Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Av, and there are no specific sponsors for this morning's shir. But of course, we, as always, dedicate our learning in the zuchos of our precious hostages. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu Amiras Hashem return them to their families, b'shalom and b'karov, in the zuchos of our precious soldiers who are fighting Am Yisrael's wars and Eretz Yisrael's wars on multiple fronts. And we hope that HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows them to be successful b'chol ma'aseh yodeim and come back to their families too, b'shalom and b'karov. Well, so with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Mem Beis 42, and we are picking up Amiras Hashem on Mem Aleph on Beis. Actually, I left off, I know, kind of in that awkward little spot, just 2 lines before. Just 2 lines before the end of the 2 dots. So just to reorient ourselves for just a moment, we've been speaking about this idea that in order to go ahead and solidify one's right to kazaka, or I should say in order to solidify one's kazaka effectively requires 2 parts. It requires residency and it requires taina. So taina, again, as Rabbi and I were just discussing, so taina ultimately means the ability to state definitively how you got to this parcel of land. So a classic example of taina, would be, so I come over to Reuven, what are you doing on my land? He's been there for 3 years. Reuven says, I bought it from you. That's a taina. Now, what we were introduced to in yesterday's daf was this concept that if I go over to Reuven, what are you doing in my field? And Reuven says, I bought it from Shimon, who bought it from you. Or, I inherited it from my father. In those cases, Reuven has to prove that Shimon lived on the field for a year, or that Reuven's father lived on the field for a year. That's the halacha. He has to prove that the person from whom he acquired the land had residency. So the Gemara says, okay, how much does he have to prove about Shimon? So again, I go over to Reuven, what are you doing on my field? Reuven says, I bought it from Shimon, who bought it from you. Reuven has to produce eidos that Shimon lived on that field for a day, or utilized that field for a day. So the Gemara says, okay, how much usage does he have to prove on the part of Shimon? So the Gemara says, what happens if Reuven can produce testimony that Shimon was measuring the field? He was on the field, he was right, he was found, he was on the field, he was seen on the field, measuring the field. So halacha l'maisa, again, is that enough? Rashi says, the Rashban says over here, Nirabo, hamocher lokeach ze ba'osa karka, lamud kama arko v'kama rachbo. So again, let's say Reuven produces eidos, witnesses come forward, we saw Shimon measuring the field. So is that enough testimony to place Shimon as the owner of the field, thereby solidifying Reuven's taina that he bought it from Shimon, who bought it from me? So the Gemara says, Amar Abai, Abai says, yep, that's great. It's perfect. That's all you need. As long as you can produce testimony that Shimon was on this field, whatever he was doing, he was measuring it, he was planting it, he was mowing it, whatever he was doing, lemais, again, that is enough. Rava says, no. Rava says that doesn't work. Why? Avit inish desir arei velo zabin. People measure land all the time and they don't buy it. In other words, this is interesting. So what Abai is saying is like this. In order for Reuven to come up with the right kind of testimony, it has to be a testimony of ownership and proper usage. So, for example, if Reuven can produce testimony that says, Shimon, witnesses come along and they say Shimon was measuring the field. So if Shimon was measuring the field, that's nice, but measuring itself is not necessarily definitive of ownership. Why? Because people go ahead and measure fields or look at properties all of the time and not necessarily go ahead and purchase it. So therefore, again, interestingly enough, Abaye says, testimony that Shimon measured the land is not enough to go ahead and create testimony about ownership. Okay? And we'll say that's how the Rambam Paskins like Rava, so I got mixed up. Like Rava, that halacha l'maisa, again, in order for Reuven to solidify his chazaka, he has to produce testimony that really attests to ownership of Shimon, and not just an act that Shimon could have done that is not demonstrative of ownership. Okay, beautiful. Let's go weiter. Interesting case here. Shlosha lekuchos mitztarfin. I suppose say, now watch this. The Gemara suggesting is as follows. three purchasers could go ahead and combine together to go ahead and form a kazaka. Now, what does this mean? Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Shlosh lekuchos mitztarfin, sada sheyesh edim shahaisa shal ruvein kol yamim. So we'll say, let's say you have a field. The presumptive owner of this field beforehand was Ruvain. Now, after that, what happens? So, Hechzik ba Shimon Shana, Kitoin Shekana me Ruvain, V'achakach Machra Shimon LeLevi Bishtar, V'echzik lo Levi Shana, V'achakach Machra Levi LeYehuda. So, listen to this case. There was a field. Once upon a time, there was a field. The field was known to belong to Ruvain. Then, year one, Shimon has possession of it. What's Shimon's taina? Shimon's taina is that he bought it from Ruvain. After that, Shimon sold it to Levi. Levi lived on it for a year. After that, Levi sold it to Yehuda. Yehuda lived on it for a year. So it says, now 3 years have gone by. Ruvain has not lived on his land, nor has Ruvain contested the ownership of Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. So the Gemara now suggests that now establishes chazaka to undermine Ruvain's claim to the field. Now, what's interesting about this case? Who does it establish chazaka for? Who does it establish chazaka for? So remember, neither Shimon, Levi, or Yehuda have 3 years of residency. But what it does do is, this is an interesting case of chazaka. Up until now, we've been dealing with chazaka that establishes ownership for someone. Really what this chazaka does is, it establishes that someone does not have ownership. Right? Who's the person who doesn't have ownership? Ruvain. Ruvain, because other people had been living in Ruvain's years for a combined 3 years, and Ruvain never objected to this. Let's go back to the Rashbam for just a moment. Right? V'echzik b'shana harei shalosh shanim v'asur Ruvain kama arer v'omer kilo machra l'shimon v'Yehuda toin harei uchzaknu beit shloshtenu shalosh shanim. Now, what ends up happening over here is Ruvain comes along and Ruvain says, whoa, 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 whoa. What are you guys doing on my land? I never sold the field to Shimon. That's what Ruvain's arguing on, right? Ruvain said, I never sold the field to Shimon. Now Yehuda, who's Yehuda? Yehuda is the guy who's currently living on the field. So this is what he's talking about. What are you talking about? We being Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, have a combined 3 years of residency, and you, Ruvain, never said anything, right? I'm sorry. V'lo machis b'shimon shalach hamimcha sha'anu ba mikocho lo hayelo lizar b'shtar yosim migimel shanim. So I'll say, so ultimately, again, so now Yehuda, the current occupant of the land, says to Reuben, you have no right to object, because between Shimon, Levi, and myself, we have 3 years of uncontested residency. That's enough time to go and establish chazaka. Now, what does Reuben claim back? Rashbam says, "V'Reuven meishiv lefi shekol echad mikem lo hechzik b'shalosh shanim elo shana lo chashti limchos shayisi roa she'atem yireim lahachzik kid mechaski inshi v'lo hayisi odeh shebishol shayisi mokrim lo zelozeh l'sof shana lefichach lo zad." Reuven says, guys, I never contested. Why? Because no one of you ever had the requisite years of chazaka. So I'll say, so this is a fascinating case. So one more time, let's outline the case. So Shimon claims that he bought a field from Ruvain, lives there year one. Shimon goes ahead and sells it to Levi. Levi sells it to Yehuda. So now between Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, they have 3 years of residency on the land. Ruvain never said anything. Ruvain now comes to reclaim his land from Yehuda, saying that he never sold it to Shimon. Yehuda said, what are you talking about? We have chazaka. Between the three of us, we have chazaka. Ruvain says, you don't have chazaka. It's my land. And the only reason I never contested is because there was a change of ownership every year. And that change of ownership prevented any one of you from establishing chazaka. That's why I never objected. So what's the halacha? So now back to the Gemara. Shlosh lekuchos mitztarfin. So we'll say the halacha is Yehuda's right. Yehuda's right that the three purchasers together have the ability to create combined chazaka. Amar Rav, now Rav qualifies this, very important, v'kulam b'shtar. This is only if halacha l'maisa, there is a claim of a shtar. Rashi says, "V'kulam b'shtar and ashnei lukuchos achronim koi." Aval lokeach rishon shalakach mila ma'arer ma lanu ulishtar de'im yesh lo shtar pshita de'in yochal arer. Now, obviously, when it says kulam b'shtar, the Rashbam just points out it must be that Shimon and Levi have a shtar, right? I'm sorry, that Levi and Yehuda have a shtar. It was obviously if Shimon has a shtar that he bought it from Ruvain, then Reuven has no grounds to make a claim that he never sold the field to Shimon. Now, obviously, he could claim that the field that the document is fraudulent. But Bepashtas, the way this case works is Shimon bought it from Reuven, but Shimon can't produce a shtar. Then there is a shtar that says Shimon sold it to Levi, and another shtar that says that Levi sold it to Yehuda. Right? So Rav comes along and says, when do we say that 3 years or 3 different owners could combine to form the years of kazaka? That's ultimately again when there's a shtar, because the logic of the shtar, ultimately, well, actually, let's see in the Gemara. Lemeimer the Savarav, shtar is lekala, ve'idim less lekala. So we'll say must because Rav holds that a shtar has a kol. A shtar generates publicity. So in other words, Reuven, the original owner, can't claim, well, I never heard that you guys are occupying my land. I was out of town. I never heard about it. So the reason he can't claim I never heard about it is why? Because there was a shtar. Once there's a shtar generates publicity. So therefore, Rav will say, here's what's happening over here. So the Gemara is suggesting 3 independent owners could establish kazaka to undermine Reuven's ownership, right? So Shimon's claiming he bought it from Reuven. Shimon then sold it to Levi. Levi then sold it to Yehuda. Now, again, the good news is that for Levi and Yehuda, there are documents. There are documents supporting that sale. The only transaction for which there is no document is the purchase of Shimon from Reuven. That's because Reuven's claiming it never happened. Shimon's claiming it did happen, but I don't have to keep my shtar for more than 3 years. So the halacha is that works. Those 3 purchasers, 3 years of occupancy, work to create chazaka against Reuven and to keep that field in the hands of Yehuda. But Rav qualifies this only works with a shtar, because since there was a shtar, Shimon to Levi, Levi to Yehuda, a shtar has a kol, shtar creates publicity, and therefore again Reuven knew full well what was going on, and he should have made a macha. The fact that he didn't make a macha indicates that he's not the owner. Beautiful, beautiful. Now the Gemara suggests over here that it must be that Rav holds that only a shtar generates a kol, but let's say eidos, general testimony, does not generate a kol. But is that true? If one sells his field with witnesses, so we'll say, so for example, I sell Reuven a field, and I sell Reuven a field with witnesses. What the Gemara is saying, what Rav is saying over here is essentially selling with witnesses is a sale with a guarantee. Sale with a guarantee that if one of my creditors comes and repossesses this field, that I will go ahead and make Reuven whole. So we'll say, now in general, the only other way to go ahead and create a guarantee for a sale, for a real estate sale, is if you do it in a document with a shtar. So the fact that witnesses go ahead and create this guarantee indicate that witnesses have a call as well. So the Gemara says it's a big difference. Hasam lukuchos inhu afsidu anafshayu. There it's different, I will say, because there afterwards, after I sold Reuven this land, any other subsequent purchasers have the obligation to do due diligence on any other transactions that I have outstanding. Therefore, again, their failure to do their due diligence ultimately represents them bringing a loss upon themselves. Okay, Membez Amadalef 42a. Umi Amarav Hachi. Did Rav really say this? V'hatnan, we learned Hamalves Chaveiro B'Shtar Government Nechasim Mishubadim. If a person lends his friend with money or with a document, I lend Reuven $1,000 with a shtar, then what's the halacha? I have the ability to collect from Reuven's encumbered properties. Nechasim Mishubadim. But if I ever only go ahead and lend him with witnesses, not in the document, then I only have the ability to collect my debt from unencumbered properties. What do you see from here? A shtar document generates publicity, transactional publicity, but witnesses do not. So maybe Rav ultimately again is a Tana, and he argues on this Mishnah. So the Gemara says, but yet again, Rav is explicitly on record that a verbal loan, which means they're both saying any loan that is not recorded in a document, you can't collect that from orphans or from inheritors, or from purchasers. In other words, encumbered properties. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, that Rav holds that it is only a shtar that generates publicity, not witnesses. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, no. Milva azvini karamis. You're conflating two things. You're bringing together, you are equating milva, a loan, and a sale. And in reality, those are two different things. Milva, when it comes to a loan, ki kayazif b'tzina kayazif. We'll say this is very interesting. In general, when people borrow money, how do people borrow money? Privately. At least for individual loans, this is true, right? When people borrow money, they borrow money privately. Why? This is very interesting. So I will say this is very interesting. See, when a person, and again, maybe this changed a little bit societally as well. When a person, at least from the perspective of the Gemara, when a person went ahead and borrowed money, borrowing money was usually a sign of financial distress. You don't exactly want to broadcast that, because if people know you're in financial distress, it may cause the devaluation of your other assets. So therefore, it's normal that when a person goes ahead and borrows money, so that's done in private. Because that's done in private, ultimately, again, there's less of a call. The only time that a call is going to be generated is really when there's a shtar. However, zvini, when it comes to a purchase, man dizabin arabe farhesya zavin, when a person goes ahead and purchases something, so purchases are always made public. Now, this is interesting. According to the Rashbam, why are purchases made public? If I have something to sell, I want my purchase to be known to the public. Why? Because again, I want a bidding war. I want the price to go up. So because of that, I make anything that I have to sell public, and therefore again, kihechi delepek lekola. In order ultimately again, that the call goes out, and ultimately again, people know about it. So therefore, I will say it's possible that when selling something, even with just Eidim and not a shtar, there's a call to the transaction. With a loan, because it is done privately, only a loan recorded in a document will have a call, but by Eidos, Bepashtos will not necessarily have a call. Very interesting. Very interesting. Good. Let's go back to it. Turn it on. So we'll say, so bottom line, the takeaway to remember for this is Rav's statement. So what was Rav's statement? This new idea by kazaka. Up until now, we've always been working with the assumption that halacha l'maisa, that kazaka works when the residency requirement is fulfilled by one person. Now what Rav is introducing to us is that three independent holders of the same different property establish chazaka against the original owner, right? So you have Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda each living on that field for a year. Shimon claiming that he bought it from Ruvain, Levi purchasing it from Shimon, and Yehuda purchasing it from Levi. Ruvain comes to Yehuda and says, "Give back my property. I never sold it to Shimon," right? I never sold it to Shimon. So halacha l'maisa again. So Ruvain doesn't have the ability to reclaim his property, right? Because halacha l'maisa, assuming there was a shtar between Shimon and Levi and Yehuda, a shtar creates a kol. A shtar ultimately again creates a buzz, creates publicity. Therefore, Ruvain had every opportunity to make a macha. His failure to do so indicates that he has ceded ownership, and halacha l'maisa again, chazaka is established. Fascinating, but again, as Rav said, it has to happen with a shtar, only with a shtar. Okay, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Tanabanan achla ha'av shana v'haben shtayim. Okay, so let's say you have the following situation. You have a father and son, a combination of it. The father utilized the field for a year and the son for 2 years. Or ha'av shtayim v'haben shana, or the father for 2 years and the son for 1 year. Again, another example of combined chazaka usage. Ha'av shana v'haben shana, or the father for a year and the son for a year. V'halokeach shana, and then the son sold the property to another party for a year. So harezu chazaka. So I'll say all of this is chazaka. This establishes chazaka. So again, same case as we had before. In this case, again, it just happens to be father and son. So again, the beauty of this case is it easily morphs into a Yerusha case, right? So in other words, you have a father who used it, let's say for example, for a year, right? Then he died, his son inherited the property, the son used it for a year and then sold it to another party. So now Reuven comes along and comes to the purchaser and says, "Give me back my land." That does not work because halacha l'maisa, there is a combined chazaka established by father, son, purchaser. Okay, the Gemara says Lamemra to lokach is leikola. So I'll say, so essentially what you're telling me is that a purchaser, right, when one purchases a land, that transaction has a call, has publicity. Therefore, Ruvain, if he really was the owner, should have known about it, should have made a macha. The fact that he did not make a macha indicates that halacha l'maisa, He's not the owner. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. It's 3 lines into the Rashbam. Lememra de lokeach miyoresh isleikala. So we'll say, so again, the fact that kazaka is established in year number 3 through the purchaser who bought it from the son indicates to us that a purchaser has a kol. And the fact that, so therefore again, I will say, Ruvain should have known about this. And the fact that he didn't make a macha indicates to us that in fact he's not the owner. Okay, Bimar says 1 second. Or maybe let's raise a kasha. Achla b'fnei ha'av shana or b'fnei ha'ben shtayim. So we'll say, so now this is the reverse case. If one went ahead and utilized property in the presence of the father. So let's say again, we'll call the father Yaakov, right? So let's say again Yaakov, Avram, and let's use Yaakov. Right? So let's say again, Yaakov was the father, and Yaakov was the previous owner, right? Yaakov was the previous owner of the property. The previous owner of the property. Take a look at Rashbam for just a moment. This is 5 lines into Rashbam. Achla hamachzik. So let's call him another guy. Let's just call him Yehuda for our purposes over here, right? So Yehuda went ahead and was utilizing property. Bifnei av. Shahaisa shalosh shana sheomer shalakcha min av. So here's the case. Yehuda is utilizing property. Now people asked Yehuda, where did you get that land from? Yehuda said, I bought it from Yaakov. I bought it from Yaakov, okay? So now, Achla b'fnei avshana, so Yehuda uses the land year one, in the presence of, right, b'fnei av, means while the father's alive, while Yaakov is alive, u'b'fnei ben shtayim. Now, afterwards, Yaakov dies, and his son Reuven inherits him. So Yehuda still uses the land for another 2 years, Okay, b'fnei ben shtayim, or b'fnei av shayim b'fnei ben shana, or again, case number 2, I both say, is Yehuda uses the land while Yaakov is alive for 2 years, then Yaakov dies, and he uses it for a 3rd year in the presence of Reuven. Okay, so we'll say, so again, these are all cases of combined chazaka, or, listen to this, then this is the part we're going to focus on, b'fnei av shana, or b'fnei ben shana, or b'fnei lokeach shana. Or case number 3, I will say, which is the one that intrigues us the most. Yehuda uses the land in the presence of Yaakov, father, year 1. In the presence of Reuven, then Yaakov dies, right? In the presence of Reuven, son, year 2, and then ubifnei ben shana, ubifnei lokeach shana, and in the presence of the purchaser, year number 3. So as I take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Bifnei halokeach, it's 2, 4, 5 lines in. Oh, we can look. Bifnei av, shahisa shalosh shana shamar shlocha min av, bifnei ben la'achar mos av, ubifnei halokeach shlocha min haben v'yesh lo shtar. Now, this is interesting. So in this case over here, see Yehuda has the land. Right now, Yehuda's claim is that he purchased it from father Yaakov, right? So now what happens? He uses it year 1 in the presence of Yaakov, year 2 in the presence of Reuven the son. Afterwards, Reuven sold this property to a purchaser, right? So Reuven sold it to a purchaser, we'll just call it. And Yehuda is still using it in the presence of the purchaser, year 3. So Yehuda's now been on this land for 3 years. In those 3 years, there were 3 different people tethered to this land. In year 1, it was father Yaakov. In year 2, it was son Reuven. And in year 3, it was purchaser. Okay, so what's the halacha? Harei zu chazaka. Interesting. It's chazaka. Yehuda has a chazaka. V'sadait chalokech isleikala ein lecha macha gidola mizo. If you assume that a purchaser, right, that when a transaction, a transaction has a kol, so the fact that Reuven sold the land to purchaser, that's the macha. That's the macha that Yehuda doesn't own the land, right? In other words, I say this is not uncontested usage. Yehuda doesn't have uncontested usage. What does Yehuda have? Yehuda essentially has 2 years of uncontested usage. Year number 1 with father Yaakov, year number 2 with son Reuven. But if son Reuven now sells it to purchaser, so a sale, if we assume that a sale has a kol, therefore again, this is a macha. The fact that Reuven sells the land to a purchaser, this is Reuven objecting to Yehuda's usage of the land. Therefore, there's no chazaka. To which the Gemara says, no. Amra papa, kitanya hi b'mocher sados of stam. So this is interesting. The Rashbam explains over here what's the case. The case in question is where Reuven went ahead and sold like his entire Yerusha. So in other words, he inherited a number of different fields from his father Ruvain, and what he did is he sold off his inheritance portfolio, his inheritance, all of his assets from his inheritance. So because of that, it wasn't a specific sale about the field that Yehuda was occupying. It was a general sale of inheritance property. Because it wasn't specific to the field that Yehuda was living on, therefore it's possible that such a sale does not constitute a macha. So I'll say, so in general, in other words, what's coming out from here in general is two things. Number one is that the sale of property is, or I should say, a sale has a kol. A sale has a kol, right? Now, why does a sale have a kol? This is what I said before. A sale has a kol because sales generally take place publicly. So, of course, anything in order to drive up the price. So, therefore, again, in general, a mechira has a kol associated with it, and therefore, in certain circumstances, the sale of property itself could operate as a macha'a against someone who is currently occupying the property, right? So, for example, let's say I have a parcel of land, and Reuven's living there year 1 and year 2, and in year number 3, I sell the property to Shimon. So let's say now after 3 years, but Shimon's in some far off place. So Reuven comes after 3 years and he says, I have established kazaka. We say, no you haven't, but Silber never said anything to me. Yes he did, he sold the land. So again, the fact that I sold the land, that's the macha. A sale, which makes sense, a sale is a macha. A sale in and of itself is an objection to someone's residency. Okay, so that's point number 1. And point number 2 that we emerge from this sugya is 3 different people can combine to form the 3-year kazaka residency requirement. Incredible. All right, I'll say, let's go weiter. Mishnah. This is a fascinating case. Ha'omnin, va'shutfin, va'risin, va'petropin, Ein lahen chazaka. Okay, so we'll say, now watch this. Let me tell you the principle outside. The principle is like this. How is chazaka established? Chazaka is established by occupying, land and using it as an owner for 3 years. Now, the only reason chazaka works is because we say to the so let's say I have a piece of land, Reuven lives there for 3 years uncontested. So the fact that Reuven's there uncontested is demonstrative of ownership. That's only true if there's no other plausible explanation for as to why Reuven is there. So for example, let's say again, Reuven says to me, Silber, I'm the new owner of your land because again, I've been here for 3 years uncontested. I say, Shmendrik, of course you've been there 3 years uncontested. You work for me, right? You're my sharecropper. I don't have to make a macha. You work for me. This is an arrangement. You've been my sharecropper for the last 20 years, right? So in other words, your presence in my field is not demonstrative of ownership because you're my employee. So the Mishnah essentially says, anytime that someone is on my field for another reason, for another reason, that does not establish chazaka. So for example, ha'omnin, I have someone working on my field, right? There's someone building something for me or working my field, right? So again, he can't claim chazaka on my field because he has a reason to be there that's not ownership. Or shutfin, or for that matter, again, I own a field jointly with Reuven, right? So Reuven can't say, well, I've been on the field for 3 years and you never contested. Of course not, we're partners, right? Arisin, sharecroppers, apetropin, executor of an estate, in all of these cases, ein lahen chazaka. They can't establish chazaka after being present on the field uncontested for 3 years. Look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Ein lahen chazaka. V'lo b'cheskas shalosh shanim mayri. Distam uman lo shayach ela b'metaltlin. V'cheskas shalosh shanim lo nemer ela b'makarkai. V'metaltlin mishu muchzak b'shal chaveiro afilu sha'achas shal roim shiotzi mitachlis. Yedo afa pi sheish l'chaveiro eidim shal nemer. So we'll say, okay, the Rashbam happens to point out over here, by the way, that this is true both with real property and movable property. He says because, for example, a craftsman, is normally someone who goes ahead and works on movable property. So I will say, so an uman has a difficult time, can't use chazaka to be demonstrative of ownership because it's common for people to deposit their stuff with him. So the idea that the Mishnah is saying is people who normally work with my property or on my property can't claim chazaka after a period of uncontested, quote-unquote, usage. Very logical Mishnah. So the Gemara says, and the Mishnah gives other examples. Lo ish chazaka b'nichse ishto. Same idea. a man can't claim kazaka in his wife's property, right? Let's say a woman comes into marriage with a parcel of land. The man goes ahead, and we know that the wife came into marriage with this. The husband now uses it 3 years uncontested. He can't claim chazaka. Nor could a woman claim chazaka in her husband's property after using it uncontested for a period of time. A father can't go ahead and claim chazaka in the property of his son. Not a son in the property of his father. So we'll say, so again, in all of these cases, halacha l'maisa, chazaka only works when you occupy property and there's no other reason that you're there other than the fact that you purchased it or acquired it from the original owner. But if there is another reasonable explanation as to why you are on this property, that prevents you from establishing ownership chazaka. Beautiful. The Gemara says, by the way, when is this true? B'machzik, only when there is a chazaka. Aval b'nosein matana, but in a case ultimately again of matana, va'achen shechalku, va'machzik b'nichse ager. Okay, so all right. So I'll say something before we get to this. If you notice, by the way, I think one of the things that has been weighing very heavily, if not on your mind, at least on your subconscious neshama, is the use of chazaka throughout this entire perek. See, I will say, but right, we've been using chazaka pretty much in one particular way, which is chazaka means using something uncontested for 3 years, in a way to establish ownership. Up until we began this perek in Basra, if someone were to ask you, what's a kazaka? You would say kazaka is a proprietary act through which you acquire something. So for example, one of the ways in which you acquire land, let's say again, I'm selling you a piece of land. I'm selling you karka. Right? How do you acquire karka? Right? So you give me money, right? Or for that matter, again, you can't acquire karka with the kazaka, right? But let's say again, right? How do you acquire karka? Or better yet, I'm gifting you land. How do you acquire that? So we'll say, what's the answer? An act of chazaka. Now, obviously, the same word means two different things. In Cheskas Habatim, chazaka has been talking about the use of property in an uncontested fashion for a prolonged amount of time, i.e. 3 years. Chazaka also means an immediate or episodic proprietary act, which is demonstrative of ownership. So for example, if you gift me land and now I want to acquire it, what do? I do an act of chazaka. What's an act of chazaka? Put up a fence. Or if there is a fence, breach it. Or go ahead and work the soil. So that's just a different form. They both in their essence mean the same thing, which is chazaka means engaging in an act which is demonstrative of ownership. Just throughout this perek, chazaka has meant 3 years of uncontested ownership. Now the Mishnah says, by the way, Bedar Murim means in what circumstances ultimately, again, has chazaka meant 3 years of uncontested ownership. So that's b'machzik. In the cases we've been talking about until now, benose matana. I'll say if I give someone a gift, or achin shechalku, or brothers are dividing up an estate, and now each brother wants to acquire his portion. V'machzik b'nichse hager. Or a ger passes away, right? The convert passes away, and he has no surviving relatives, which means that his property becomes hefker. And what's the halacha? No, if you go ahead and close the door. Gadar, put up a fence. Paratz, make a breach in the fence, koshu any amount. Harezu chazaka. This is demonstrative, ultimately, again, of a proprietary act. And I will say, you acquire the object immediately. Right? So for example, again, if I see, by the way, nichse ger is an example of anything that's hefker, right? I see a piece of hefker property, I want to acquire it, sprawling myself out on it does not acquire it. You have to do an act of chazaka, a proprietary act. So I put up a fence, I breach the fence, I close the door, I do something that's chazaka. So just another use of the same word. Incredible. I will say, Amud Beis. Avoid the Shmuel Levi. So as I say now, we're going to focus on the first part of the Mishnah. So the first part of the Mishnah is very, very important, which taught us that the concept of establishing chazaka by utilizing the land uncontested for a prolonged amount of time only works in a case of someone who's not there for any other plausible explanation. But someone who's on my property, and there's another plausible explanation for that, doesn't establish chazaka. So watch this. So Avua de Shmuel Levi, so the father of Shmuel and Levi, Tanu, in their version, they had Shutaf ein lo chazaka, the chol shekein uman. shutaf partners cannot establish chazaka on jointly owned land, and all the more so a worker can't. So in other words, we'll say, just to illustrate the shutaf case, so for example, imagine the following scenario, right? Reuven and Shimon are partners, right? We know that they're own partners. Now, Reuven uses, we'll call it the half of the field uncontested for 3 years. Uncontested for 3 years. So Reuven says after 3 years, I made a chazaka on that land. So again, no, you haven't. No, you haven't. The reason why it's uncontested is because, again, you're partners. In other words, it's normal for you guys to use land, and it's even normal for each of you to use a particular parcel for a prolonged amount of time, and that's not demonstrative of ownership. So Rabbi Shmuel Levi say, shutaf can't establish chazaka, and all the more so an uman, right? All the more so an uman. All the more so a worker. Okay, so Shmuel Tani Uman ein lo chazaka, aval shutav yesh lo chazaka. So Shmuel, interestingly, it sounds like Shmuel disagreed with his father, right? And Shmuel said an uman cannot go ahead and establish chazaka unless he again on property that he's working on, but partners can. Partners can go ahead and establish chazaka with each other. If you look at the Rashbam over here, Avashutav Yishla Chazaka is the last of the white lines on top. Tim Isa de lo Machar lo Chalko Hayelo La'avodas Ha'adama V'Lecha La'Peros B'Shutvos. So this is interesting. So Shmuel says, if they were really partners, then they would be doing everything together. They'd be doing everything together. The fact that Reuven is working one part of the field by himself for a prolonged amount of time is demonstrative that they had a division of assets and he acquired that portion of field. It's interesting, by the way, like a machlokis of how exactly partnership works. In other words, Avod Shmuel and Levi clearly feel that even in a partnership, it's normal for partners to do their own thing. Right? Shmuel seems to say the nature of a partnership is you do everything together. And therefore, again, when you see one partner working one part of the field all by himself, that's demonstrative that there must have been a division of assets. And therefore, again, that partner who was working on that part of the field by himself for 3 years uncontested has a chazaka on that field. Okay, so we'll say machlokes. Va'az de Shmuel tamei. Now Shmuel who says, now we'll say, so again, this is very interesting, and obviously it contradicts our Mishnah, right? Because our Mishnah said that shutfin partners cannot establish chazaka one on the other. Shmuel is coming along and saying shutfin can establish chazaka one on the other. So the Gemara says, "V'azla Shmuel l'tamei." Shmuel goes according to his reasoning. Damar Shmuel, hashutfin machzikin ze'alzeh. Shutfin have the ability to make a chazaka one on the other. Not only that, umeidin ze'alzeh. Now we'll say they could testify on behalf of one another as well. Look at the Rashbam. It's actually great. The Rashbam is right across. So the Gemara says, umeidin ze'alzeh. Umeidin ze'al chelko shalzeh. La'amido biyado imba echad min hashuk la'arer alav v'lo havi nogeh be'edus. So we'll say this is interesting. Let's say again, Reuven and Shimon are partners, and someone comes to contradict, all right, Shimon's ownership. Reuven could testify on behalf of Shimon. Now that's quite unique. Why? Because we would say that there's nogea be'edos, that he kind of has like a conflict of interest. Again, we'll explore that a little bit more. V'nasin shomrei sachar zelazeh. This is interesting. Not only that, but Reuven and Shimon, when they're partners, automatically become a shomer sachar, one for the other. So for example, I'll say, if let's say again, in the context of this partnership, Reuven is watching something for Shimon, or Shimon's watching something for Reuven, or let's say Reuven's watching something for Shimon, and the object is stolen from Reuven's house. So the halacha is that a shomer chinam, an unpaid custodian, is pater for gneva v'aveda. A shomer sachar, a paid custodian, is chayv for gneva v'aveda. So the Gemara says something very interesting. And again, we're going to explore each of these ideas. But people in a partnership with each other are automatically considered to be a shomer sachar, paid custodians for each other. We'll see why that is. We'll see why that is in Mirat Hashem. Good. So let's go back to this. The Gemara says, so this is the position of Shmuel. Now, for our purposes, again, what's coming out is that Shmuel holds that partners can establish chazaka. So both say, this is so incredibly important. So what this means, for example, is according to Shmuel, if Reuven and Shimon are partners, right, and they have a field, they have a big field, and so they divide the field in half. Reuven says, you work this half, and Shimon says, I'll work that half. So if they have it recorded in a document, great. But if it's not recorded in a document, what it really requires is that Reuven and Shimon both make a macha on each other's working lots, right? To say, by the way, I'm still the owner of this and I'm still the owner of this, because failure to do so could allow each of them to make a kazaka on the piece of land that they're working. Our Mishnah says there's no such thing like that, because it's understood that partners often divide up land, work their respective portions, but yet still have a joint ownership interest. It's a very interesting distinction. So the Gemara goes weiter. So I'm really Rabbi Rabbi Yehuda. B'ma'arta debei Rav Zakai. So this is very interesting. So Rabbi Abba raised the question to Rabbi Huda. Rabbi said there's two different gersals over here. B'ma'arta means in the burial cave of Rav Zakai. In the Hagos Habach, he changes it from ma'arta to ma'atzarta, which means an olive press. An olive press, which seems to read a little bit better, right, than the burial cave. But either way. Right? He says, Mi amar Shmuel shutav yesh lo chazaka. Did Shmuel really say that? And I'll just point out over here. Fine, we'll come back. It happens to be that there's an interesting chap. If it is the burial cave, there's an interesting idea. But let's first finish up the Gemara. Fine. So the point over here is Rabbi Abba raised the question to Rabbi Yehuda, and he said as follows. He said, did Shmuel actually say that a shutav has chazaka? Miyamar Shmuel shutav yesh lo chazaka. Did ultimately did Shmuel really say that a shutav has chazaka? Vamar Shmuel, but Shmuel said shutav kiyored birshus dami. But Shmuel said that a shutav is like someone who occupies property with rishus. Look at the Rashbam. Kiyored birshus dami kilomar kiilu nasan lo chaver rishus vitzivo lihios bimkomo kidin oris dami. So Rabbi say, but Shmuel said elsewhere that essentially a partner, a shutav, is no different than a sharecropper. What does that mean? That, in other words, a shutav, Rabbi say, someone who has permission to be there. Remember, what's the whole chap of chazaka? Why does chazaka work? Chazaka works because when someone sits on my property for 3 years, and otherwise they would have had no reason to be on my property, other than the fact that they bought it from me. And they were there 3 years uncontested, that establishes chazaka. But as the Mishnah told us, if someone has a valid reason to be on my property, other than the fact that he bought it from me, then he can't establish chazaka. So Shmuel said, a shutaf essentially is kiyor b'shus, is like someone who has permission to be on the property, like a sharecropper, and therefore can't establish chazaka. That contradicts what Shmuel just said before. Shmuel just said before that a shutaf, a partner, can establish chazaka. Here he's saying a partner can't establish chazaka. So what's going on over here? Lav lememra. The shutaf ein lo chazaka. Isn't Shmuel saying that a shutaf can't establish chazaka? To which the Gemara says, no, lo kashya, ha dinachis lekula, ha dinachis lepalga. So Shmuel said there's a big distinction over here. One case is talking about where he went ahead and he occupied the entire field, and one is talking about where he occupied part of the field. Look at the Rashbam. Dinachis lekula, sada de shekanu shnehem. Dinachis lepalga bechelek hamufchar hechzik va'amar chalkenu chalaknu v'gia zala chalki ve'achzakti bo shalosh shanim v'idach tan adayin lo chilaknu elakach chisnenu beinenu sheta'acha osa chelek gimel shanim v'ani acharecha kimo gimel shanim. So I will say the Gemara wants to suggest there's two different cases. One is talking about a case where partner number one occupied the entire field, and case number two is talking about again where partner occupied part of the field. Now it's interesting, the way that Rashbam understands it over here is, let's say Reuven occupied the best part of the field for 3 years. After 3 years, he says, oh, you see that it's mine. So Shimon says, what are you talking about? The way our partnership agreement works is you use the best part of the field for 3 years, and then I'll use the best part of the field for 3 years. Now the Gemara says over here, and I both said there's a whole machlokes over here exactly which case refers to what. In other words, which case ultimately again is the case where Shmuel says kazaka, which case is where there's not a kazaka. So there is ambiguity in terms of which case Shmuel said forms the kazaka, doesn't form the kazaka. Okay, Ravina said havaha dinachas lakula. Ravina will say again. I'm moving forward past that resolution because that's not going to be the accepted one. Rather, let's focus on Ravina. Ravina said havaha dinachas lakula. In reality, so we'll say remember, here's what we have. Right? What's our problem? Our problem is Shmuel. Our problem is Shmuel, right? What's the problem with Shmuel? Shmuel's contradicting himself. Shmuel said at the top of the Amud that ultimately, again, a shutav can establish chazaka. Partners can establish chazaka on each other. Then Shmuel's on record as saying partners can't establish chazaka on each other. So obviously, again, it must be that Shmuel's referring to two different cases. So Ravina says, Hava hadinachas lekula. Both are talking about cases where ultimately, again, we'll call them Ruvain, is utilizing the entire field. Velo kasha, had ispa din chaluka, had lespa din chaluka. One is talking about a case, Rabbi say, where, remember we had this earlier on in the Masechta, partners, right? Partners have a right to dissolve a partnership as long as the partnership property is large enough to be divided. So I'll say, so Ravina says like this. Both cases are talking about where Ruvain, right, is working the entire field. Now Ruvain is going ahead and working the entire field, and after 3 years is claiming chazaka. So the Gemara says, but Ravina says, what's the difference in the two cases? One is where halacha lamaisa, again, the field is large enough to be divided, and one is where it's not large enough to be divided. Look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Ravina amar hava hadinachas lakula hadinachas ba'din chaluka arba amos lazeh arba amos lazeh havi chazaka dechevan diyesh kedei lazeh eino minag la'aniach ha'echa lahaktim lo chavero gimel shanim el imkein machar lo chalko. So I will say, watch this. This is fascinating. Here's the case. Reuven and Shimon were partners. Right? We knew that. Reuven's been working this entire field for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, Reuven claims ownership. Now, what does Reuven claim ownership over? What does he claim ownership over? The entire field. Essentially, what he claims is Shimon sold me his partnership interest. So now, does that claim work? So Ravina wants to suggest something very interesting. Ravina says it depends on the nature of the field. Let's work backwards. If it's a small field, small as defined, that it's not large enough to order a division. So in that case, again, I both say, it's interesting, how would partners normally utilize such a field? Because it was so small, essentially what they would do is, the way they would work it up would be, partner A would work that field for a certain number of years, and then by himself, and then partner B would work that field for a certain number of years by himself afterwards. So therefore, again, uncontested use for a prolonged amount of time is not demonstrative of ownership, because that's the normal usage. So therefore, again, when does Shmuel say that partners ultimately, again, can't establish chazaka, right? When does that occur? In a field that is so small, that ultimately, again, you can't order a division of it. In that case, Reuven's use of it for a prolonged amount of time in uncontested fashion is not demonstrative of ownership. On the other hand, if the field is large enough that it can be divided, so we'll say the normal way to use that field is how? Both partners utilize it side by side. If you have a case of where Reuven is using it uncontested for a prolonged amount of time, that can be demonstrative of ownership. So that's how Ravina is reconciling the two opinions of Shmuel. So we'll say, so just to be clear, so what we have over here is as follows. We have a machlokes, right? We actually have two machloksim. Machlokes number one is, can a partner establish chazaka in jointly owned property? So our Mishnah says no, right? Avod Levi and Avod Shmuel and Levi say no. Shmuel says yes. But even when does Shmuel say yes? Only in certain circumstances. So what Ravina is suggesting over here is the only time Shmuel says yes is when it's a field that is large enough to be divided. If it's that big, that means normally both partners will work side by side. If one partner is working the land solely for 3 years, he could assert chazaka. But if it's a small field, so small that you can't order division, then it would be normal for partners to take turns farming it solely, right? Solely farming it. Therefore, again, uncontested use for a prolonged amount of time cannot establish chazaka. So we'll stop over here for today. And Mirat Hashem, again, we'll get the resolution on this in Mirat Hashem tomorrow. Learn a little bit more about jointly owned property. Tremendous shkoyach. All right, Chevron, have a great day, everyone. It's good to see everyone.